Hi there. What you are seeing here is the game state at the end of a game of blue versus grey, the Civil War card game. Now it comes in two versions. I think it was originally published by QED, set up by the designer QED Games, Evan James, I think. In these two boxes. It's a card game, but not a collectible card game. You just need these two boxes. So I guess they were just packaged separately for if one player wants to buy one side and one player buys the other side, or something friendly like that. So you have a box for the north and you have a box for the south. They each have about the south, I think, have 76 playable cards. The north have 80 playable cards. Then there's some extra cards. You have like a duplicate of the map. So the maps is built as the game progresses. There's another set of cards, sort of shared between the two decks of the whole map, so you can have it set out on the side to plan before portions of the map are actually revealed. I hope that's clear, that you can. I'll just zoom in so you can see that the board as such is created out of cards. Then there's also about 23 cards in each deck that provide rules. So you have here, like, this is the victory conditions, how to win, and what the conditions are. And you've got the whole rules in both decks on the cards. So the rules obviously don't come out on the game table, but all the other cards potentially can. So the game ended when, for me just now, just played 2 games recently, and the second game ended after the North had played all their cards and the South still had about 10 or 12 to play. All the other cards had come into play. Some were in the respective hands. I was playing solo, so I have the north hand here, the south hand here. So this is fairly obviously the southern card display, and that would be the northern. So the northern player would sit here and those cards would be facing the other way. So it is a card game, and what you see laid, apart from the hands and the informational cards, these have combat results on them and the combat table. These 2 cards show the supply, so each side, every side needs 1 point of supply to attack. It's not that supplies and for a couple of other reasons, so you record that there. So you lay cards from out of your hand onto the table, but these are not like tricks you take. They're forces. So and you have essentially an eastern theatre and a western theatre. There's some. The north have naval squadrons which can move from sea zones and up rivers and so forth. The south, theirs is factored out. They have 1 or 2 what are called Enigma cards, that they're kind of like special event cards that offer, say, southern ironclads and things like that. So they're not actually represented as forces. So typical force that you might lay from your hand, probably in stages, would be this. So you have here William Joseph Hardy, leader. So he's a corps commander. He has a sort of fighting strength of 2. He has initiative of 2. Initiative is either 0, 1 or 2. So he has good initiative, not very high fighting strength, but higher than some. That's 0. Goes all the way up to, say, 4 for Lee and A.S. Johnson and Grant, and so forth. And then beneath him he has, on the Confederate side, each of these is a division, and it has just a fighting strength. You have a lot of flavour text here, and there might be 1 or 2 sort of special abilities also noted in this point. Some units or commanders have that. So, and he can have 4 divisions attached, and he's got 1, 2, 3, 4. So he's got his full complement of divisions. So you might play out of your hand just a leader with a division attached, or 2, or you might just play a division on its own and later play a leader down. So you play them out of your hands, and then there are forces which are available in your theatre. And the Union are exactly the same, except let's just quickly take, okay, we'll take Grant just for the sake. Here we have Grant, and so he can carry 2 armies or and also 1 corps. So the Union units are a corps rather than divisions. So they are stronger. Their sort of fighting strength is generally strong. Well, yes, generally stronger than any Union division, but obviously so they're sort of bigger and bulkier. So although they work the same way, so you know a comparable Union leader might carry as many corps as a comparable Confederate leader carrying divisions. But then the thing is you have something like, for example, Grant and Sherman, who are there's some army commanders. The other leaders are just corps commanders, or well. For the Confederates, you have corps commanders like Hardee, and then, say, A.S. Johnson's an army commander. So he can take subordinates, and he can take 3 subordinates. So he could take, for example, here he has William Hardee, Earl Van Dorner's cavalry, which is attached to him as an extra. He's got Hardee, Darnay Herndon Maury, and Daniel Harvey Hill. So he's got Hill, Maury and Hardee underneath him. That's his full complement of subordinates. So he's an army commander. Now the Union lower level leaders are army leaders. So for example, you've got Joseph Hooker here, and he can command 5 corps. But they are gathered by, we have here Sherman and Grant, so they're army group commanders. So they're the higher level commanders equivalent to Lee, A.S. Johnson, and those might be the only 2 army group. I think there's only 2 army group commanders on either side in this game. And so they can each only carry 2 subordinates, and Sherman can carry an extra corps as well. Whereas A.S. Johnson in the west probably, and Lee in the east probably can carry 3 subordinates with them. So you lay them down and you gather your forces, and then you will so you start your turn by essentially you will draw some cards and some supply. And you might, as units have 2 steps, essentially. Well, yes, units have 2 steps, so they have their normal strength and then a depleted strength. So you might also spend supply or lieu of a card draw to undeplete units. And then you will go to the move deploy step. You will essentially deploy units from your hand and then say where you're going to attack from. So then you go to the map. And there's no actual movement, although it's called a move deploy step. I think it's move deploy because you can move your forces about, in the sense that you could say Hill could be moved from Albert Sidney Johnson. You would detach him and you could leave him alone in the Western Theatre. Or each side can have 1 rail transport, so you could move him over to the Eastern Theatre, but he would not be able to fight with the rail transportation that turn. So you have a certain amount of replacement of leaders at the beginning of your turn, detachment of leaders, maybe attachment of subordinates to an army commander, or attachments of new divisions or corps, and it's all quite strictly controlled, so that it's not free. You have limits on it, and then after that you'll say, right, I'm going to be attacking. So after the deploy move segment you have the combat segment, and the way this works is that, let me turn on the light, I'll get maybe it's a bit brighter here. I don't know if that helps, but essentially the way this works is at this point you can see that the Union is controlling all of these, but what you would do is you would say, okay, from any point where you control that is in supply, so if, say, these, for whatever reason, these two Union controlled cities become cut off, they would not count in supply. So actually I'm not going to rule that. There's certain situations where a cut off city you can defend, but I think generally you can't attack unless it's a native city. I can't remember exactly the rules, but the basic situation is, you would attack out of Nashville to the next adjacent city on the map, which would be Chattanooga or Decatur, or you might go from Forts Henry and Donaldson to Corinth. So you can move along rail or road lines or along river lines, either way. And so you just point where you're attacking to and where you're attacking from to check the supply line, and then you would go into combat. Now there are extra wrinkles in it, like leaders with 2 initiative can attack 2 cities out, but then you're at danger of being cut off if you are attacked by the opposing player in the following turn. And say if Grant attacks from Fort Donaldson to Tupelo without taking Corinth, he'd be fine in Tupelo, but if he was attacked and defeated, he wouldn't be able to retreat through Corinth back to Fort Henry and Donaldson, and his force would get wiped out, he would get sacked, and etc. So there's no moving forces around on the map. There's just gaining ground and then saying where you're going to fight from the ground that you have gained. So it's not it's not operational, except but it's not grand strategic, because you're not really worried about things like the sort of detailed political rules and supply rules and things like that. Although it is a bit operational grand strategic in that the politics do come in, such as some leaders are favoured, some are disfavoured, and some will subordinate to others, some won't. But it's just in relation to each other here. There's no politics in relation to the overall situation, of reducing supply. Although you can reduce supply and card draws depending on if you reduce your opponent's rail net. And if the Union has a blockade on the CSA and things like that, that kind of cumulative effect can help. So in that grand strategic sense, but it feels quite operational in the sense of you see what forces you have operational in the field, and you're not moving them, but you're determining who's in charge and which units are with which, because like Hood's division is stronger than Hill's division, Pickett and Hill's division have the equals sort of fighting force, and so on. And some units have sort of special abilities, for extra variability and flavour in the game based on their historical performance and so forth. So when you declare an attack, it's a very simple thing. It's a d6 roll, and the only results are attacker routed or attacker defeated. That's the same result, except with routed you get more units, one more unit depleted. Or there's a general's battle or a soldier's battle, and then defender defeated and defender routed. So it's never certain. The general's battle, it's just a straight 1d6 equal chance. There's no odds or anything like that. That comes in the sense, if you roll a general's battle, well then the general with the higher initiative wins. If you roll soldier's battle, well then the force that has 5 or more points than the other side wins. And that is it. Then you can get stalemates, in which case you will both take the same type of casualties. Then the only things that modify that d6 roll is if you go in with a force 10 points stronger than the other in fighting force, then you get +1. If you're attacking a fort, you get -1. And what else is there? Have I forgotten anything? yeah, if you're defending with more points, then it's a -1. And then the only other sort of changing factor is that certain places are labelled Confederate pest holes, so they were kind of difficult to attack, or they it was really easy. And for whatever reason, it was difficult. They were pesty for the Union, and so that gives the Confederate a +5 for fighting strength as in those battles. So and then so you decide who the winner is, and then you check casualties. So both sides will take casualties, and it depends on the number of your units that you play in. So if you are the victor, and you have 4 units, you will take 1 depletion. If you're the defeated with 4 units, you will take 3 depletions. If it's a stalemate, you will both take 2 depletions, and it works like that all the way up to if you have 14 or more units, then you could take 10 depletions at stalemate. And then you also always roll 2 dice, D6 for the result, and then a red dice they recommend for a result, and a white die for the casualties. So the casualties on a 1 to 3 are light, 4 to 5 are normal, 6 are heavy. So if it's light, it's 1 less depletion. If it's heavy, it's 1 more depletion for each side. And so unless you have a small force, you're probably always going to lose or have some units depleted. And if you have a large force, even if you win, you're going to have a fair amount of depletions on you. So it's very nice in the way then you have to handle things. Now after the combat phase, there's I can't remember what they call the phase. They call it reorganization. Now, if you didn't do any fighting, you can then spend 1 supply and completely reorganize for free. So then you can just move leaders wherever you want and put whoever you want under them without attachment and detachment restrictions, and without worrying about limited rail or movement and so forth like that. But the Union generally has to be attacking. The Confederate is often defending, so they often may not do anything. They don't have as... The Union always has 1 more card, maybe more, drawn. So, and you can take supply in lieu of a card draw, but you always have to, say, take a minimum of cards. So the Confederate might be reorganizing, while the Union's always trying to fight and isn't able to sort of finesse their attack so much, just having to attack with what they've got. So it makes for quite an asymmetrical experience for either side. Then after the reorganization phase, there is a regroup phase, and that is when you can then spend supply again to restore depleted units. So you spend 1 supply and restore 3 depleted units. Now you can see that's not very much, and if, say, that the Confederate has 4 card draw and the Union 5, and they need 2 or 3 cards each, they only get 1 or 2 supply, and they want to fight, you can see your options are limited. Are you going to draw more cards in the hope of getting a decent leader? You need some more units, but then you want to fight, so you need supply for that, and then you've been fighting, your units depleted, so you need supply to restore them, and then you have a big battle. And I use these markers to mark the depletions. They recommend turning the cards, but of course that can get terribly fiddly. And you might have, say, 10 or so depletions in one army group or an army. And so you're spending 3 supply just to deplete most of your men. It can get very costly and make decisions difficult to deal with. If a unit is depleted twice, well, then it goes to what's called the cadre. So on either far side, essentially what you're seeing is this is the Confederate Western Theatre, and that's the Union Western Theatre. That's the Union Eastern. This is the Confederate Eastern. And then over here we have cards that have been played and discarded for special events and so forth. And then right on the far side is the cadre. So these are either leaders that have been sacked, or leaders that for one reason or other, maybe you detached all their units and they went to cadre. because they have no units underneath them, and also units that have been depleted twice. Then you can draw from there in lieu of a card draw, so, or effectively for 1 supply point, you could say. So you can either take from the deck or from card draw once you have fellows in there. So you can lay men by, but then it's quite costly, isn't it, to bring them back? And if you've been fighting a lot and you've lost, like the Union had quite a few corps in Cardia, not now, they had to bring them back out for their final push. So that's essentially how the game plays. Now I'd like to say just a little bit more about the combat, because that is very interesting, before I go into talk a little bit more about the cards. And then what I intend to do is close this video not after too long a time, and then tomorrow hopefully, or in a day or two, play a turn or so on camera, so that you can see in detail how it happens. Now so the thing that I'd like to say about combat that is also interesting, that makes it more interesting than I just spoke about, is a bit difficult to show from this far away, but I'll use just Albert Johnston here. And by the way, I really like that Albert Johnston he doesn't have a high initiative, he's only got initiative of 1, but he has a high fighting value, as high as Lee's. Lee's got 2 initiative, which is the best you can get. But I like the way he's well represented here, because I think, having read a biography of Johnston, admittedly it was by his son, so some people have said it's too hagiographic, but I think he got short shrift. I think he was playing an excellent game of poker with very few forces and delaying the Union for a long time in the West. So I think he did marvellously, although he didn't have dramatic battles that he won and so forth like that. He did a very good job delaying the Union in the West, because he didn't have the forces really to attack them. And of course, when he did manage to muster them and surprise the Union magnificently with it, he unfortunately was killed. So we'll never know what, if he hadn't been killed, would the Confederates have won Shiloh? How would that affect the war, etc.? So I think often he's denigrated because his record, people say, oh, well, he never did anything on the West. And then when he did try to fight, they lost. And so he's I don't think he's given the credit he deserves. But anyway, that's a whole aside. So I'm just going to take him as an example. So say he goes into combat with just Hardy and Maury attached to him, and he goes into combat against, just say, Oliver Otis Howard, who, so Howard with just 1 corps underneath him. So that's obviously a very weak force. He doesn't want to bring all of his force to bear. So once you've declared where you're attacking, and the defender's declared if they're going to defend and who's going to defend, someone in their theatre, or there's a chance where you can defend cross theatre depending on supply lines, which is a very different thing from the supply points. They're completely sort of separate concepts in this game. But so say you're attacking a very weak force, that you then go to the next step where you take it in turns as the attacker and defender to withdraw or add troops. So you can add troops, not new leaders, but you can add units from your hand. So say, or you can withdraw them. So Albert, he might in fact, in his attacking point, said, okay, I'm just going to attack with Hardy, and I've left Maury behind. So that's one thing which could happen. And so Maury's now detached. Or he could bring him with him into the campaign, but then he says, okay, I'm just going to turn Maury over and all his subordinate units, and so I'm just going in for this battle with Hardy. So now if we win it, or if we lose it, we're not going to take as many losses as if we'd gone into the battle with a huge amount of men. I think that nicely simulates, you would get stragglers in the campaign, you would get losses, there's always losses from disease and stuff before you get to the actual fight, and then you might have a crushing attack but then sustain a lot of losses in doing so. So it behooves you to balance your forces lightly. So say Johnston starts, says, okay, I'm withdrawing Maori. And then Howard says, okay, I've got such and such court in my hands and they're coming out. And there are some restrictions on cards, like there's East and West cards, and there's option rules which can add more restrictions and so forth, and other abilities. So now Howard's looking pretty strong, and so Johnson's going, oh no, I didn't think you had anything in your hands. I can't turn them back up because they've been unturned, but maybe he's got something in his hand which he can add in. And so you'd keep going back and forth like that until both of you pass in succession. So Johnson might say, oh, I pass, and Howard says, okay, I'm happy with that, I pass. And then they go, or Howard might add in another card. Now Johnson's saying, oh God, I thought I had a chance. I definitely don't with that. I'm going to have to come in. And it might not be a unit. There's some Enigma cards, they're called. And they are those special event cards. I think I mentioned that earlier, didn't I? So some of these are added as reserves from the hand. And they might have an effect like you have Swamp Angels, which help with Union fort attacks. Or you have Infernal Machines, which is a late war card. So there's certain cards which go to the bottom of the deck as you draw them, and they only come out in the late war, and they will add bonuses and so forth like that. And you go on and until you get to you've both passed, and then you roll the die, and then find out who won, or if there was a stalemate, you check the casualty die. And then I actually roll 3 dice at a time, because on a doubles, the Confederate will take a leader loss, and if you combine die roll of the red and the white die is 7, you take a Union leader loss, and then you check this portion, the combat results table, and it says the leader's killed or wounded or sacked, and it's either your choice or your opponent's choice depending on the roll. And sacked and wounded, essentially they go to card, but there is a difference in that. Depending on unit losses as well, like I can't remember the exact details, but I think leaders that are political disfavour, if they're sacked, they're permanently out of the game, so forth like that. Otherwise they would go to Cadre and come back. Killed and you're gone. Now each side, you have a few at start cards. Each side has one that will allow you a miracle from God, or Grant would have actually died, but he had the devil's own luck, and so you always get one leader saved by the grace of God or the devil. So you're not really going to lose Lee or Grant too easily like that. Yeah, and then so that's sort of how the battles go, and there are more details, but this isn't a rules explanation. So that's generally how the game plays out. Now, one more thing to mention is the victory conditions, and that sort of brings in also the Enigma cards, because there's lots of flavour in the Enigma cards. There's things like La Belle Rebelle, so the lady that famously held up one of the Union generals, and it allows you to look at the northern player's hand, and if you play it at a battle in the Shenandoah Valley, then you get plus or minus 1 to your benefit as the Confederate. But then there's lots of stuff like that to do with like draft riots and copperheads, partisan rangers, ironclads, like I said, and more. You've got special orders, number 191 that were discovered by the Union, and John Brown's body and stuff like that. But then there's also crucial cards that relate to the victory conditions. So, for example, the Union, there's some cards chain as well, like the Union has habeas corpus. If you don't play this before the Confederates have played, before you play Emancipation, and the Confederates have played Copperheads, then it's harder for the Union to win the game. So, there's certain things you have to watch out for. No game will ever be exactly the same depending on some of those things, although the broadscape. It's not, they don't make things totally random. But you then have Emancipation Proclamation, and the Union also have the 1864 elections. So the way that victory occurs is that each side is amassing victory points. You add them as Union and you subtract them as the Confederate. And if Washington is captured, and it has special garrisons that the Union get at the start and they can add to, but if it is captured, and it can happen, really probably at the beginning, at the outbreak of the war, then the Confederates win. Or if the Confederates get -4, if we have net -4 victory points, the Confederates also win. And that's going to happen if the Confederates take any native US city, and essentially the Union hasn't played out. For example, if you take Harpers Ferry, the game I played before this, the Confederates did actually win on -4 victory points they had taken Harpers Ferry their first turn. They got a card which gave them wheeling, which is generally neutral, which enabled them to drive up to Pittsburgh, and then they took Cleveland no, I don't think Lee was out, but they had a good lead, and the Union were finding it hard to muster forces, and I probably didn't play them too well. But essentially, they gained 3 cities from that, and it took Cleveland up to the lakes, which cut the Union rail net, which gave them another victory point. So they had 4 victory points and won the game. If you get -3 victory, so that would be a winner. Or if before Emancipation card is played, you get -3. Now the Union had played Emancipation, but then the Confederates got the extra victory point. Now, then there's the 1864. When the 1864 comes out, it will go to the bottom of the deck, but you poke it out so you know it's coming up. The same late war cards also go to the bottom of the deck, but you don't. They're not sticking out. So unless you are good at card counting, you won't know exactly when you're going to hit late war. Late war is kind of like the last quarter of the game, I would say, depending on how if it runs to the end. If essentially the Union are not doing well, so they're only on +3 or less by the 1864 elections card, then the Confederate win. If they're on +4 or 5 by the 1864 elections card, and when it first comes out, they have to stick at the bottom of the deck. When they get to it again, they have to play it. So if they're on +4 or +5, the war continues. If they reach +6 before the elections come out, then the Union win immediate operational victory. If the Union get +6 at any point after the elections, they also win, but it's an attritional victory, so it's happened later in the game. The Csa Attritional Victory would be if the Union has used up its whole deck and played its bonus turn, so they get 1 bonus turn at the end of the game, and they're only on +5 or less, then that's the Csa Attritional Victory. Now the Union get victory points for every, no, not every, they get, for control of the whole Mississippi, they get a victory point. For establishing a blockade, which is essentially just getting 2 naval squadrons cards out of the deck and plopping them down, they get a victory point. For occupying Richmond and Atlanta and the Shenandoah Valley, so those are each individual points. The Mississippi's a whole bunch of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cities from island number 10 down to New Orleans. City, they're called cities, but obviously island number 10's not. If they destroy the Csa rail network, so that's slightly certain rules to do with that. If they occupy all Atlantic ports and all Gulf ports, they get a point for each of those. So you can see the victory points are giving you the scope of the war. You've got to cut the Mississippi, occupy the ports if you can, get the Shenandoah Valley, get Richmond. If you've got Richmond, then you get Atlanta, or if you can't get Richmond, get Atlanta. So it's got all the broad strokes you're brought into there. And the Csa, like I said, they have a chance early on, and they get victory points for occupying any native US city and severing the rail net. They have a chance at early victory, but really if they don't get that early victory, then they're just trying to go for their attritional victory at the end of the game by stopping the Yankees from gaining their operational or attritional victory, depending how early they win. And that's sort of it in a nutshell. So last thing which I should say a few words about is how the map builds up. So when you start the game, you only have these 4 map cards out, and then the rest of the map cards, each side has one of them. So there's 2, they have a letter, so there's A, B, D and E here. C is in, each side has a C card, each side has an F card, and so forth all the way down to H. And so I think C has 2, I can't remember which side, but and it's important, but it essentially, the Union C card, C is Kentucky. If the Union can play it, and it's, yeah, the Union has 2 C cards. One of them is it becomes Union friendly, and the other, the CSA has a C card that's CSA friendly. So that would affect supply lines, and that would give, say, that would be the difference between, does the Union have, where's the C card gone? Does Union get island number 10? So certain, or is it given to the Confederates? So certain occupationals, you can say certain battles are actually abstracted out in the cards as you play the map cards down, if it's in the Union favour or the Confederate favour. And also the Union have a neutral Kentucky card, so they have a choice. They might get a neutral first, and they might say, oh no, I'm going to hang on till I get the Union friendly, but then they don't, then Confederates do something, and it's the once they've played it neutral, they can't then make it Union friendly after. So it's a question whether to play that out quickly or not. So all the cards are slightly better. So even in the Deep South, you would get things like, this was the Union version of H, which I think that might have given the Union New Bern. Whereas if the Confederates had played their H card, yes, here it is. There you go. The Confederates have New Bern instead of the Unions. Then you get some other slight changes in, for example, this is the Confederate Savannah, Macon, Boston. Now in the Union one, I believe that Savannah is not a fort, so it just simulates, something happened that made it better for the Union. So the map builds, and the Confederate always have to play their map cards, but the Union don't have to. It's their choice. So they might hold it in their hand. They might want to hold out for something better, or they might want to play a different card. When it doesn't, that doesn't actually come into it, because the Confederate, that you have to put the map card down and then you draw another card in lieu of it. But the Union can kind of hold back and make a decision on that. Generally, they're going to be putting it down, but I think it's, at least in the sense of Kentucky, it's going to be a decision whether or not to. I'm not sure if there's other situations where they might want to or not. But anyway, that's how it goes. So you start with a restricted theatre. The West is essentially not in play. You only have the East, but it will quickly come into play as and when the others want it. So, or as it comes up, which is going to make the game different. Now you might not get Kentucky decided early on, but you might have the Eastern theatre extended. So then that will give your game's going to be being more about, perhaps, at least initially, about sorry about that. I'm not able to pause this video. I haven't yet found an app that can successfully pause I got an iPhone 8 Plus that was given me here that can successfully pause the video. Now I had one that's disabled the zoom, and then I had found another, but then that kept shutting down. And so at the moment I'm having to stick with this. The iPhone's got a nice zoom, but sorry about the blurred image you've been seeing there. But not a good... I got this camera so high up I can't, to get the whole spread, I couldn't see what was on the screen, so I've been talking beside it. Anyway, so I think that gives you the picture. So I'm going to break this down now, and you can see you need, although it's a card game, you need quite a good spread to play it. It's only a 2-player game, but they recommend 3 foot by 3 foot, and obviously these cards would be in your hand, but you need at least this space for all the forces laid out, and then you have your played cards, your cadre, and played and cadre, so you need some sort of side place as well, and your draw deck would be here, and noting supply and so forth. So that is an overview of Blue versus Grey. I think it's an excellent game. It's quite a different game, and although it's a card game, because you're laying out forces, and then you have ability to move them around, it never feels like a random draw is going to win the game. I've played it quite a bit, only solo so far, but I've played it quite a bit because it's a very pleasant game to play. The rules on the cards, I successfully played with it to start with. There were some clarifications needed. Like some fellow rewrote the rules and posted them on the Internet Board Game Geek, probably Consim World 2, and Web Grognards. So he rewrote the rules. That's very handy to have. You can read them online and search through them like on there, or I printed them out. So just say it's quite an elegant game, and it's not too complicated, but there's it does get down into the itty bitties, so it's not a simplistic game at all, and it gives you some very meaningful decisions to make about how to perform with your forces, and your sort of draw choices and supply choices, and when to attack, when to defend, when not to defend, and so forth. The games, like this last game, was very close. First game, okay, that was bold moves by the CSA, and maybe not optimum play by the Union, but it gave them the win. They had an opportunity and they took it. That opportunity wouldn't always be there, because they were fortunate that Wheeling, they were given a card that normally Wheeling's just neutral at start, but they had an Enigma card which gave them Wheeling just at the time when they needed it, and they played it, and also had the forces able and the boldness to go for it. It could have cost them heavily in reprisals from the Union. Now that's one thing obviously you don't get in solos. You don't get the bluff of what your opponent has in his hand, but sort of try and play it quite sensibly for either side, and not foolishly, considering pretending I don't know what the other fellow has. And most of the time, I don't remember exactly anyway. But